Hi guys, a channel called Faith Because of Reason just released a massive video on the resurrection. It's a very ambitious video that aims to both prove that Jesus rose from the dead and respond to most major skeptic objections of the topic. I'm familiar with the channel and the guy seems to know a lot about this. So let's take a look at his case. Here is his formal argument for the resurrection. Premise number one, there is testimony saying that Jesus was resurrected. The Gospels. Premise number two, this testimony comes from the credible sources. Premise number three, there are only three logical possibilities with respect to credible testimony. It is true, it is deliberately false, or it is honestly mistaken. Four, the credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is not deliberately false. Five, the credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is not honestly mistaken. Six, therefore, the credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is true. Seven, if the credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is true, then Jesus was resurrected. 8. Therefore, Jesus was resurrected. Okay, first of all, let's take a closer look at premise number 2.
Arguably, premise 2 is the most controversial premise within the entire argument. It asserts that the testimony pertaining to the resurrection of Jesus in the four Gospels is credible. By credible here, I mean that the sources of information originate with someone who is in a good position to know if some event happened, such as an eyewitness.
I have a small complaint here. This is simply not the definition of the word credible. The definition of the word credible, according to the dictionary, is offering reasonable grounds for being believed or trusted. Merely being in a position to know the truth does not automatically make you credible. One also has to be honest to be considered credible. However, it's not like he's trying to sneak in honesty into the premise, because premise number 4 specifies that the disciples were lying. So this is not a big issue. Okay, so like David is trying to deny skeptics the ability to say that the Gospels were the product of a long chain of oral tradition, where some of the stories got embellished over time and legends got added to the Gospels and so on. He's like, okay, skeptic, I will take it as established that it was Matthew himself who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. So Matthew was either lying in his Gospel or he was mistaken. Now, it doesn't seem like the disciples were lying because they were risking death and persecution over their beliefs. And there is simply no way that all of them could have been mistaken to the degree that all of them hallucinate Jesus eating fish at the same time. That's just not possible. So the only alternative is that the story must be true. Okay, but here is the first big problem with this argument. Skeptics are usually not going to grant that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, because this position has been rejected by almost all biblical scholars. In fact, he's very aware of this, and he mentioned this himself.
This is probably the most controversial premise within the argument because the overwhelming majority of New Testament scholars believe that the Gospels are late and anonymous and certainly were not authored by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
So, how is David supporting this controversial premise? In this case, he's referring us to another one of his videos, where he allegedly makes the case for the traditional authorship. Now, I don't have time to go over all of that here, so I'm simply going to do the same and refer you to this video of Apologia, which discusses many common authorship problems. But since this is such an important premise, I don't want to simply dismiss it with an appeal to scholarly consensus. Let's think about this a bit. Let's say that his argument succeeds in showing that traditional authorship is correct. Now, just how strongly does it prove it? Does it prove it beyond reasonable doubt, like over 90% chance of being correct? Now, given the fact that almost nobody in scholarship agrees with his position, I highly doubt it. I think that even in the best case scenario, he may manage to show that traditional authorship is just slightly more likely than anonymous authorship. However, I think that his resurrection argument needs this premise to be extremely certain instead of just more likely than not. So premise number 2 doesn't manage to reach the level of certainty that David would want to have here. Even if there is just a small chance that the traditional authorship of the Gospels is not correct, skeptics will simply say that this scenario is more likely that a man actually rising from the dead and should therefore be preferred as an explanation. Next, we get to premise number 4, that the disciples didn't lie about the resurrection. David's first argument is to say that they had nothing to gain from lying.
Against the idea that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were deliberately lying, 2 points can be made. First, it seems that they had nothing to gain by lying about this. There is no obvious benefit to be gained by deliberately misleading people into believing that Jesus had been resurrected.
Now, this is obviously not true. Luke 8, verse 1 to 3 specifically says that the followers of Jesus gave the disciples money and provided for their means. So the idea that they had nothing to gain from keeping the cult alive is ridiculous. Does David really think that there is absolutely zero benefits involved in being a cult leader? If he does, he should take a look at how cults actually work in the real world, because he's quite mistaken here. There is a second argument offered against the notion that the disciples were lying. If you are even slightly familiar with Christian apologetics, you have probably heard of this. It's the famous argument from martyrdom. Basically, the argument says that we know that the disciples were lying because they were martyred or died for their faith, and nobody will ever die for a lie. Let's check it out.
There appears to be every reason not to lie about something like this. The early Christians faced intense persecution at the hands of the Romans. I have already addressed Moss and other skeptics in considerable detail on this point in a previous video. Hence, skeptics of this premise are referred to that video for an extensive defense of the persecution and martyrdom of the apostles against the leading critics. Suffice it for now to say that the persecution of the early Christians is well attested in Acts, the Gospels, the writings of Paul, the writings of the early church, and even in Roman sources like Tacitus and Suetonius.
First of all, let me notice that once again, scholarship consensus is against him. I quote: as historiography, the scholarly consensus is that Luke Acts presents a skewed picture of the hardship faced by the early church. While evidence for isolated incidents has been found, there exists no historical evidence for systematic persecution of early Christians by either Jews or the Romans during the period Luke Acts was likely composed. In addition to that, let me show you what Bible scholar Dan McLaren has to say about this.
The persecution that early Christians experienced was overwhelmingly isolated, limited, and brief. It was not programmatic and widespread and enduring. If you want more on this, I would highly recommend Candida Moss's wonderful book, The Myth of Persecution. There's no evidence that any of the authors were writing in a period when they knew they were taking on significant risk.
To be fair, his other video probably responds to some of this stuff, but I gave it a quick look and just notice how late most of his sources are. 203, GR 220, 796, and so on. This is like over 60 years after Jesus died. By that time, most of the disciples were already dead, so this didn't affect them. It doesn't tell us how strong persecution was on the years directly after Jesus died, when the disciples first began their preaching. It could be that initially the authorities thought that the movement would die out without Jesus and decided to pay little attention to the disciples. Who knows? Maybe the real persecution only began around the year 60 with Nero, and by that time the disciples were either already dead or had already enjoyed 20 to 30 years of being cult leaders. I have an additional argument for this. So, and this is kind of an original argument. What if at the beginning of their preaching, the disciples saw something like a low risk thing? Maybe there was some persecution, but the odds of actually getting caught were pretty low. My evidence for this comes from the book of Acts. The book of Acts covers a time span around 30 years after Jesus' death. At some point, it says that the Apostle James was unalived by Herod. It doesn't mention any other disciples sharing this faith. Now, I think it's safe to say that if any other of the disciples had been unalived, Acts would have said this. This means that during 30 years of allegedly risking their lives, only one of them actually ended up dying. Now, for me, this means that A, either the disciples were really good at hiding, or B, the actual odds of dying were actually quite low. There is yet another thing one could say here. Premise number 4 says the testimony is not deliberately false, but the way David uses it, it may as well say every single detail in the gospel narrations is true. This is because later on he will appeal to all of those details when defending his case against skeptics. I can imagine some scenario where Matthew does genuinely believe that Jesus rose from the dead because of some visions or social contagion or whatever, and nevertheless chooses to embellish his narration of the events simply because he thinks that the story will work better at winning converts, or because he wants to cover up some of embarrassing details of whatever. I think a scenario like this is perfectly plausible, but apologists rarely consider it. They see it as a black and white thing where either Matthew was lying about absolutely everything, or every single detail in the gospel must be true. An additional problem for David is this: we know that Matthew lied, at least in some parts. We simply know this. Why? Well, because of all the mistakes and contradictions that we find in the narrations. Later on, he tries to harmonize some of them, but as we will see, he doesn't make a good job. Next, David discusses the issue of the empty tomb.
To the extent that we are going to posit that the disciples were honestly mistaken, then we must accept that they at least genuinely believed their own reports contained in the Gospels. This means that we would have to accept their witness to the fact that Jesus' tomb was really empty.
An empty tomb by itself doesn't prove very much. There are many naturalistic ways to account for this. Allison says, it does not take a supernatural agent to empty a tomb. Perhaps some pious detractor, hoping to prevent veneration of Jesus' remains, quietly removed them. Or maybe a gardener moved the body, for reasons forever unknown. One can also envisage sorcerers keen on a body or body parts for magical rituals, or a would-be supplier for sorcerers stealing Jesus' corpse. A related proposal, with the same results, has it that the women went to the wrong tomb. So there are many ways that a skeptic could explain this. Next, we get into the issue of hallucinations. One of the most common responses to this skeptic objection is that they cannot explain narration of the entire group seeing Jesus, because group hallucinations simply don't happen.
The best option open to the skeptic here is to suggest that these experiences of the risen Jesus were grief hallucinations. But there are numerous well-known difficulties here. Probably the most important is that Jesus appears to groups of people within the Gospels. Hallucinations, much like dreams, are private to the individuals who have them and cannot be shared between or among different people.
Actually, Dale Allison gives us plenty of examples of group hallucinations. There are many examples in parapsychological journals of groups of people claiming to see a ghost or something like that. Let me offer a quote from Allison. There are, on the contrary, many first-hand accounts of several people seeing at once a person recently deceased. For a strikingly close moral parallel to what Maren proposes, a parallel in which three witnesses report seeing a recently deceased man walk across a lake, see Sir Ernest Bennett, Apparitions in Haunted Houses.
Skeptics will sometimes suggest that there have been such things as group hallucinations, but it's important to realize that in these cases, we are not literally dealing with different people seeing the exact same thing or having the exact same visual experience. What we are dealing with is groups of people who are all having individual but similar hallucinations.
Okay, how do you know that all of the disciples saw the exact same Jesus, as opposed to a kind of similar Jesus that later got written as we all saw Jesus? And how do you even know that all of them saw him? Maybe some of them didn't see him, but decided to go along with it because of group pressure or whatever. Another common argument is that the disciples did not expect Jesus to rise from the dead.
What's more, group hallucinations typically occur among individuals who have some level of expectation or have been primed to have them. While one could argue that Jesus' predictions of his own resurrection caused such an expectation, in fact, the evidence within the Gospels suggests that the apostles expected nothing of the sort. The depictions of them there show them to be despondent and afraid that they will be killed next.
It could be that one of them, for example Peter, had an hallucination despite his despondent state, and after sharing this with the rest of the group, the initial despondency wore off and they started to expect an appearance. Again, Dale Allison makes a big case in his book of why one cannot say that the disciples were not expecting the resurrection. I propose, then, that we begin by considering the fact that the Gospels have Jesus on multiple occasions foreseeing not only his death but also his resurrection. We cannot expunge all expectation and excitement from the resurrection witnesses. According to 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3 to 8, Peter was the first to see Jesus. Obviously, he did not keep this fact from his friends. Another point David makes is that the skeptic scenario is very unlikely because it involves the conjunction of two already unlikely things.
The implausibility of hallucinations as an explanation is going to be exacerbated by the implausibility of the explanations for the empty tomb, with which the hallucination theory must be conjoined in order to adequately explain all of the evidence. Habermas and Lacona add, combinations of theories generally lead to higher improbability, not a more probable solution.
So, in other words, if the body being stolen is something unlikely, and the disciples having hallucinations is something unlikely, then the combination of these two things, which the skeptic needs, must be even more unlikely, because two unlikely things need to come together. So, what is my response to this? My response is to say that this reasoning is fallacious because the two events are not truly independent. Rather, one can cause the other. The body of Jesus being stolen and the finding of the empty tomb could precisely be the thing that ended up triggering the hallucinations. So the second event becomes more likely if the first has already happened. Next, David talks about Humean objections to the resurrection, which basically involves saying that the supernatural has such a low prior probability that even the most improbable natural explanation should be preferred over it.
I have addressed arguments of this sort at length in my video defending the rationality of belief in miracles. There I showed why David Hume's version of this objection fails, and so do modern iterations thereof. Skeptics wishing to object on these grounds are referred to that video, but for the time being, suffice it to say that there is no good argument for assigning an infinitesimally small prior probability to the occurrence of a miracle.
Here is what he says. Well, to be fair, one would have to look at the full video. I don't really have time to watch all of it. What I would say is this. Maybe skeptics haven't shown that a miracle has an infinitesimally small probability of happening. But apologists haven't shown that naturalistic explanations have an infinitesimally small probability of being true either. So we're on the same boat. I don't need the actual odds for your miracle to be infinitesimally small. I just need them to be lower than the probability of my explanation. So this concludes the first section of the video, which attempts to make an argument for the resurrection. The rest of the video is dedicated to answering some famous skeptics on this topic. The first is the one who is probably the top skeptic scholar in the world, Bart Ehrman. If you know Bart Ehrman, you may know that a big part of his case for the Gospels being unreliable rests on the many contradictions present in the story. David attempts to argue against this by suggesting that the contradictions are just matters of peripheral and insignificant details.
The veracity of the core events in historical reports is not jeopardized when inconsistencies exist involving peripheral details that are of little significance.
No, this is not true. This is so not true. I can't believe apologists make this point. If you actually look at the contradictions, you will immediately see that these aren't just differences in small details. Okay, these are contradictions in very big issues. For instance, the flight to Egypt contradiction between Matthew and Luke. Matthew says that Mary and Joseph went to Egypt after Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. Luke instead says that they went back to Nazareth after Jesus was born. How on earth is this a small detail? These are two completely different stories. Another example, the different genealogies of Jesus. A small detail would be if we had a difference on one or two of the names listed. But no, what we have is two completely different genealogies. They completely contradict each other, and they each came to be Joseph's genealogy. A third example is all the different elements in the stories of the women finding the empty tomb. Which women went to the tomb, how many angels were present, what words did the angels say, and so on. Now, taken individually, one might say that these are just details, but the stories contradict themselves in all of the elements. So at the end, you have like four completely different stories. Just go look at John's account of the empty tomb and tell me if it looks anything like the other ones. It doesn't. It's a totally different story. This is not a one detail kind of situation. It's all of the details together. So no, this excuse is not good. Now let's see if David can harmonize all of the differences in the story. But first, some words about this. The way harmonization works is by doing a lot of mental gymnastics in order to try and come up with an ad hoc and contrived scenario that can logically accommodate both accounts. Bart Ehrman has some words on this.
In theory, just about anything can be reconciled if you work hard enough at it. I walked to Chicago yesterday. Well, I was on the plane and I walked up and down the aisle. So technically speaking, I did walk to Chicago. Okay, but that isn't how we talk, right? We don't talk that way. So in theory, you can reconcile anything in the Bible you want.
Now, with that in mind, let's have a look at what David says.
First, how many women went to the tomb? The answer is that we don't know exactly how many because none of the Gospels purports to be giving a full list. This fact also means that there isn't any contradiction here. A contradiction would only emerge if one of the Gospels claimed to be giving the entire list, and this list didn't contain some of the names on another list.
Okay, I can grant that the issue of which women went to the tomb is relatively easy to harmonize. If one guy says Diana and Jessica went to the tomb, and another guy says Natalie and Sophia went to the tomb, I guess one could logically say, oh, it could be that Diana, Jessica, Natalie, and Sophia went to the tomb. Sure, this is logically correct, but why would the guys decide to word it in this exact way, in the way that it creates so much divergence? It's a bit weird, to say the least, and it does add up to the cumulative case, as we will see. The second issue is that Matthew's Gospel seems to imply that the women witnessed an earthquake and saw the angel rolling the stone, while the other Gospels appear to deny this.
Second, did the women witness the stone being rolled away from the tomb? Matthew would be the only gospel which might indicate that the women witnessed an angel rolling the stone away.
His solution is to say that Matthew could be read as talking about something that happened in the past and was not witnessed by the women, and that the guards had already left by the time that the women came to the tomb.
Often in the New Testament, the aorist tense needs to be rendered by an English pluperfect. So Matthew 28, 2 through 4 could be inserted in brackets and translated with no impropriety, and behold, there had been a great earthquake. We may thus conclude that the earthquake took place before the arrival of any women, and that the terrified guards had already left by the time they arrived.
There is an obvious problem with this. If the earthquake happened before the women came and the guards had already left, then how does Matthew even know this? How does he know that there was an earthquake? How does he know that the guards shook in fear and became like dead men? Matthew will have no way of knowing this. Did the angel brag about this to the women? Like, hey guys, guess what? I scared the crap out of those George earlier. And it also caused an earthquake when I came down. It was so cool. No, this is silly. This harmonization doesn't work.
Third, How many men or angels did the women see at the tomb? It should be said once and for all that the mention by one evangelist of two angels and by another of one does not constitute a contradiction or discrepancy. If there were two, then there was one.
I think the harmonization of, oh well, if there is two, then logically there is also one, is absolutely ridiculous, and it stretches language to an absurd degree. Like Bart Ehrman says, this is just not how we talk. If someone tells you, I just saw two men walking over there, you don't think to yourself that there could have actually been three men or four men or five men with the excuse that, oh, if there are four men, then logically there is also two, right? Nobody does that. This would be an extremely weird way to word things, and it's just not how language is used, not how language was used back then, for that matter.
Fourth, what did the angels tell the women? Did they tell them that Jesus would meet them in Galilee, or did they ask them to remember what Jesus had said to them in Galilee? I frankly don't see any reason why the angels couldn't have said both of these things.
Logically, sure, I guess one could believe that the angel said both things, but it seems more natural that the angel will tell them one thing instead of a bunch of things. If the message is too long, the women may end up forgetting it.
Sixth, did Jesus only appear to the disciples in Galilee or in Jerusalem?
No, that's not the contradiction. The real contradiction is where was Jesus' first appearance to the disciples after the resurrection?
A plausible reconstruction of these events would be that the women told the disciples what they had seen. The disciples did not believe the women until Jesus appeared to them at Jerusalem, after which they obeyed his command to go to Galilee and saw him there again.
There is a problem here, and it's that both accounts are presented as the first appearance of Jesus to the disciples. Luke makes it very explicit that the appearance in Jerusalem is the first time that Jesus appears to the disciples. And while Matthew doesn't say that the appearance in Galilee was the first appearance, there are two things that heavily imply it. First, Matthew has the angel saying the women that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. This makes much more sense if that's going to be the first time they meet Jesus. If Jesus was planning to appear to them in Jerusalem earlier, the words of the angel almost feel like God is playing some kind of prank on them. Like, hey, surprise! I'm here earlier. I told you Galilee, but here I am in Jerusalem. Second problem, Matthew says that some doubted when Jesus appeared to them in Galilee. And again, this makes far more sense if it was the first time that they saw Jesus, as opposed to the second time. Go read Matthew 28 for yourself, and you will notice the same thing. Finally, I have some closing words on this. The strength of Bart Ehrman's case does not simply rest on each individual contradiction, but on the cumulative case of just how many contradictions do we have. Just look at how many problems there are, and they're all on this short story. If the Bible had just like one single problem, one may let it slide. But when you get a ton of mistakes and contradictions, at some point you have to admit that the gospel are just not reliable history. Later on, we get into Dale Allison, who says that the story of the risen saints in Matthew is an invention.
Similarly, Allison concludes that Matthew's story of the saints rising in Jerusalem is certainly not historical.
Basically, the problem is that this is a huge event, and for some reason neither Paul nor any of the other Gospels felt that it was worth mentioning. David's response here is to say that the other Gospels writer could have had some reason for this omission.
Unfortunately for Allison, it's fairly easy to think of a reason why Mark, Luke, and John wouldn't have included the story of the raising of the saints. It's not directly relevant to Jesus' story.
It's not directly relevant to the Jesus story? Really? God sent a massive sign at the moment that Jesus resurrected, and you don't think that this is relevant to a story? How on earth is this not relevant? One could maybe imagine some reason why one of the gospel authors decided to omit this huge story. But out of the three of them, I think this really stretches credibility. Next, David discusses the issue of rainbow bodies, which is a full chapter on Allison's book. For those who don't know, Rainbow bodies is a Buddhist miracle that appears to have some eyewitness testimony backing it up, just like Jesus' resurrection does. It involves a dead body getting smaller and smaller over days and then suddenly disappearing. David's resolution is to say that this Buddhist miracle doesn't necessarily contradict any Christian doctrine, so one could theoretically believe in both miracles.
It's not immediately clear how the phenomenon of rainbow bodies would conflict with any doctrines of Christianity. So the Christian may not have to reject this phenomenon in order to retain his Christian beliefs.
It may not directly contradict Christian doctrine, but it strongly implies that Buddhist doctrine is true. Don't you think that if God performs a miracle that strongly supports Christianity, and then performs a miracle that strongly supports Buddhism, then he's being a little misleading here? I mean, come on. Another thing he said is that the rainbow body miracle and the resurrection are different because the people who make claims of rainbow bodies do not face persecution for their claims.
This phenomenon of rainbow bodies is perfectly acceptable within Buddhist communities, and so, unlike the apostles when they proclaimed the resurrection, the witnesses in these cases were not opening themselves up to a serious threat of persecution and death for the most part.
But this is simply not true. Buddhists who make claims about rainbow bodies actually do risk being jailed by the government. Let me show you a quote from Dale Addison's book. In fact, the episode we came to a show was not the last. In 2001, on January 3rd, a Bonpo monk named Raksi Totem died in eastern Tibet. After he allegedly began to manifest the signs of rainbow body, his nephew noticed the praise and sought to measure the yogi's body as it contracted. When, however, the Chinese government learned of the matter, authorities put the nephew in jail and called a halt to the affair. In fact, modern people who make public claims of rainbow bodies are arguably risking themselves even more than the disciples did in Judea, given the fact that the authorities nowadays are far more likely to find out about this. Now, let's get to the next part. David is analyzing the arguments of Matthew McCormick, who has made the case that testimony-based evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is comparable to the evidence that we have for witchcraft at Salem witch trials. Let's take a look.
If we take seriously the attempts to prove the resurrection of Jesus on historical grounds, then, in order to be consistent, we must also accept that the Salem witches actually performed acts of black magic.
David's fifth argument is the common apologetic idea that a resurrection will have been something unexpected in Judaism.
The point, again, is just that the Salem witch trials occurred within a context where people were already primed to appeal to witchcraft as an explanation for certain events. By contrast, the proclamation of Jesus' resurrection occurred in the context of Second Temple Judaism, where there was no expectation at all that a resurrection would occur in the middle of history.
The problem with this is that by the time that Jesus died, the disciples could no longer be considered typical Jews. Rather, they would be more similar to members of a new cult with Jewish roots. The cult leader, in this case Jesus, could have added some new beliefs on top of their traditional Jewish beliefs, like a belief in a resurrection.
That there were sufficiently vicious inner conflicts and divisions to lead to these sorts of false accusations.
This doesn't explain cases of husbands testifying against their own wives or women testifying against their own sisters. And if the answer to this is to say that one spouse can secretly hate the other one, my response would be to use their own logic against them and say, oh, but this is unlikely.
We know that human beings are, as a general rule, strongly motivated to protect their own well-being. So the motivations to not deliberately lie are not even remotely similar for the respective witnesses in these cases.
Actually, if you get caught lying in court, you can get into a lot of trouble, just like the disciples did. So you cannot say that the people in Salem had nothing to lose from lying, and could just lie in court like it was nothing. David also writes, unlike the resurrection, some witnesses recanted. Actually, we don't know if any of the disciples recanted. We don't know if they even had the chance to recant. And even if, let's say, if Bartholomew had recanted, do you think that the early Christians would have preserved the memory of it and written it in the Gospels for the world to see? I don't think so. So I don't think this is a valid argument.
Some of the witnesses are just known to have been fakes. Baker points out that one of the principal early witnesses was Mary Warren, who was supposedly being afflicted by someone accused of being a witch, and yet had a remarkable recovery as soon as her master threatened to whip her.
Are you kidding me? Her master threatened to whip her if she didn't stop, so she forced herself to stop. What is that supposed to prove? Anything said under the threat of violence is considered not valid, and this also applied to this alleged recounting.
Margaret Jacobs famously recanted of her testimony, saying that it was all a lie.
Okay, so out of the many hundreds of accusations, a few turned out to be a lie, and he thinks that this refutes the whole thing. Okay, but that's like pointing out to the apocryphal gospels, to show that some early Christian documents were known to be fake, and then conclude that the whole thing must be fake.
While it is possible that the erratic behavior of the girls sparked a mass psychological phenomenon,
If some girls acting weird can cause a mass psychological phenomena in an entire town, I don't think it's a stretch to say that the visions and honest conviction of Peter could also cause a chain reaction in the other disciples, a group that was much smaller and much more closer to Peter.
a considerable amount of deliberate fraud eventually took place, carried out for a range of reasons.
Yeah, just like the apocryphal gospels or the many forgeries and fake letters that didn't even make it to the New Testament.
Scholars have speculated that Abigail Williams might have accused people because of the attention she received.
The disciples would have also gotten plenty of positive attention from previous followers of Jesus, so they had a motivation to keep their cult alive. David also asks why don't more people who have hallucinations end up believing that the people they see on their visions are resurrected.
One crucial question that Fodor does not consider is if hallucinations are common, why are such experiences not regularly understood as resurrections?
Dale Allison also addresses this argument in his book. The answer is context. The reason why a widow doesn't believe that her husband has resurrected after having an hallucination is because her husband was not an apocalyptic preacher who predicted his own resurrection. Also, people today are far less superstitious than people 2000 years ago. This fact alone makes it almost silly to ask, oh, but why don't modern people who hallucinate end up believing that some guy resurrected? Another argument has to do with why the hallucination stopped after 40 days.
The appearances of Jesus began 3 days after the crucifixion and then ended abruptly around 40 days later. Is it Fodor's belief that the group hallucinations actually began precisely at this time and then sharply ended 40 days later?
So the question is like, why would hallucinations suddenly end after 40 days? If this was like a medical thing, one would expect them to keep hallucinating every now and then, like many mentally ill people do. I think this is a fair question, so let's give it some thought. Dale Allison has one response to this. First of all, notice that it's only Luke who mentions this whole 40 days thing. Allison says that Luke made it up because of theological reasons. I quote, how close to the historical truth is Luke's assertion which features a biblically harrowed span of time? Does it have a basis in early tradition, or is it a retrospective theological judgment without literal merit? Is it any closer to the fact than Luke 24, where the resurrection appearances seems to be over and done with after one day? I know that David is not going to like the proposal of Luke basically making things up. So let's see if I can come up with a natural explanation that doesn't involve Luke lying about this. It depends on how often you think that the disciples were hallucinating. If you imagine the situation as the disciples were hallucinating the presence of Jesus on a daily basis, then yeah, it could be weird to say that they just suddenly stopped after 40 days. But maybe the disciples were simply sporadically hallucinating Jesus. This was stronger at the beginning and then later started to gradually fade off, with the last recorded instance being around 40 days. I think this scenario sounds more plausible in a naturalistic sense, and the situation described in Luke could easily accommodate something like that. And that was it for today. In conclusion, this was a very well made video, but I do not think that David has made a compelling case for the resurrection. To be fair, I didn't fully watch all of the videos that he claims support some of these premises, but it's like 6 other videos, and this one was already 6 hours long. So at some point, it's like, okay, I don't have time to go through his entire channel. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.